Piers Morgan walked onto Lorraine Kelly's set that morning with the swagger of a man who had weathered every kind of controversy the media world could throw at him, from live on-air walkouts to explosive debates that left studios trembling with aftershocks. But even with his decades of experience and his instinctive readiness for conflict, he didn't anticipate the peculiar tension that greeted him the moment he stepped into the brightly lit studio, a tension so thick it felt like he had walked through an invisible curtain of static, something electrically charged, humming beneath the surface. As he adjusted the cuffs of his blazer and flashed his familiar half-smirk at the crew, he noticed immediately that Lorraine's usually warm expression was missing, replaced instead by a forced smile that trembled at the edges, the kind of smile hosts put on when they've been told by producers to behave, to be professional, to keep things smooth even when they'd rather storm out of the room themselves. And Piers, who was more perceptive than most people gave him credit for, caught that microsecond of strained cordiality and raised an eyebrow, amused but cautious, because something about her demeanor told him this interview would not be the soft, friendly, morning show banter most guests received. The moment the cameras blinked to life with their red lights glowing like small watchful eyes, Lorraine launched into her introduction with a tone that carried sweetness wrapped around steel, and as she said his name, there was the faintest hint of an edge, a sharpened note that slipped beneath the scripted words, and Piers instantly recognized it, recognizing as well that she had come into this segment with an agenda, perhaps to challenge him, perhaps to corner him, perhaps even to expose him in a way she thought the viewers would enjoy, and instead of backing down or smoothing over the tension, he leaned into it as naturally as breathing, because confrontation, for Piers Morgan, wasn't just a risk of his job, it was practically his native environment. The interview began civilly enough with a brief mention of his latest project, but Lorraine wasted no time before pivoting into pointed territory, bringing up a recent on-air argument Piers had been involved in on another network, asking him with saccharine politeness whether he ever regretted the way he spoke to his colleagues or whether he simply thrived on stirring trouble, and Piers laughed, a deep amused laugh that echoed slightly through the studio, as he told her that having an opinion did not equate to stirring trouble, that disagreements were a natural part of robust discussion, and that he would rather speak bluntly than pretend to agree for the sake of politeness. Lorraine countered swiftly, suggesting that bluntness was often a mask for rudeness, and that some viewers found his style abrasive to the point of unnecessary hostility. And Piers, never one to back away when he smelled challenge, leaned forward as if settling into the comfort of a familiar battlefield, replying that honesty sometimes sounded abrasive to people who preferred sugarcoating, and that he would never apologize for refusing to dilute his views to fit neatly into the mold of morning show gentility. The conversation began to heat up with an intensity that even the producers hadn't anticipated, because Lorraine, emboldened by her rising frustration, began interrupting him, pressing him about past controversies, bringing up old headlines that Piers had grown tired of defending, and he fired back with characteristic sharpness, pointing out inconsistencies in her questions, accusing her, in a tone both teasing and edged, of going for sensationalism under the guise of concern for public discourse, which made Lorraine bristle visibly, her cheeks flushing with irritation as she insisted that she was simply holding him accountable the way journalists were supposed to, and Piers, unable to resist, remarked that accountability should also apply to television hosts who sat in judgment while pretending not to, a remark that caused an audible gasp from someone on the crew, a sound so out of place during a live segment that it momentarily disrupted the artificial calm of the studio. Lorraine's composure cracked, just slightly, just enough for Piers to see the spark of anger flaring behind her eyes, and she pressed even harder, accusing him of belittling female colleagues in past debates, a claim he immediately pushed back against with controlled irritation, saying that he challenged ideas, not genders, and that reducing heated debate to gender dynamics was lazy analysis at best. Lorraine retaliated by bringing up the most controversial moments of his career in rapid succession, as if hoping to overwhelm him with sheer volume, but Piers countered each one with unwavering confidence, and the back-and-forth escalated into a verbal duel so intense the crew exchanged panicked glances, unsure whether they should cut to commercial or let the dramatic flames rise higher, because the tension between them had grown so dense it felt like the oxygen in the room had thickened, like everyone watching couldn't quite breathe. Finally, when Piers interrupted one of Lorraine's increasingly barbed questions with a curt remark about her selective moral outrage and how convenient it was for morning hosts to play innocent while taking subtle jabs, Lorraine snapped, not loudly, not theatrically, but sharply enough that the entire studio felt the shift, and she told him that if he hated the format of morning television so much, he was welcome to leave, to which Piers replied with a coolness so cutting it could have frozen the cameras in place, saying he didn't need an invitation to walk away from a conversation that had become intellectually dishonest, and with that, he stood up, straightened his jacket, and stepped off the set while Lorraine sat speechless for a fraction of a second before regaining her host reflexes and attempting to pivot the chaos into a controlled exit, but the damage had already been done. Piers Morgan had walked off Lorraine Kelly's show mid-segment, leaving behind a studio buzzing with shock, a crew scrambling to recover, and a host whose forced smile had completely vanished, replaced by a tight, stunned expression that revealed exactly how fiery their confrontation had become. As Piers stepped off the set and into the narrow backstage corridor, he felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with a curious sense of vindication, because despite the chaos, despite the cameras and the crew's wide-eyed stares, he knew he had maintained control of his own narrative even as Lorraine Kelly had attempted to trap him in a series of questions designed to provoke conflict rather than explore substance, and the hallway itself seemed oddly quiet compared to the storm that had just erupted on set. The bright studio lights replaced by the softer fluorescent glow of the corridor, which gave him a moment to process what had just occurred and why it had escalated so quickly, because in all his years of live television, Piers had learned that timing, tone, and framing were everything, and yet somehow, what was meant to be a routine interview to discuss his recent book, his charitable endeavors, and perhaps a few light anecdotes from his personal life, had devolved into a fiery exchange that would inevitably be dissected endlessly online by commentators eager to magnify every word, every pause, every smirk, and he knew that even though he had walked away in composure, the story would take on a life of its own, morphing into headlines about celebrity tantrums, host failures, and explosive television moments that would dominate news cycles for the rest of the day, and he felt a mix of amusement and irritation at this, because as someone who had been in the public eye for decades, he understood both the inevitability of media amplification and the absurdity of how quickly nuance evaporated when cameras were rolling. He paused by the green room door, taking a deep breath as he adjusted his tie, reflecting on the peculiar choreography of live shows, how producers juggled timing, content, and audience expectations while guests tried to balance honesty with diplomacy. And he considered the many instances in his career where he had navigated similar waters but never encountered a scenario where a host of Lorraine's experience seemed to deliberately bait him, as though the show had been transformed from a platform for meaningful conversation into a kind of verbal battleground, a subtle arena for testing wills, and while he was not the type to shy away from confrontation, he still valued integrity, civility, and, above all, the truth, which was why he had chosen to leave the set rather than allow a skewed narrative to dictate the story for him. As he walked past crew members who gave him tentative nods or hurried away with whispered apologies, he considered the psychology behind the exchange, the way tension builds when two strong personalities collide under bright lights, the role of ego, timing, and perceived slight in escalating conflict, and the invisible scripts that both parties had been following without ever realizing they were on a collision course, because in live television, every facial expression, every syllable, and even the pauses carry weight far beyond what the human ear perceives in real time. And as a veteran media personality, Piers recognized how easy it was for such moments to spiral beyond anyone's control, turning into spectacles that viewers would remember more than the substance of the actual conversation. He paused at the stairwell leading to the exit and ran a hand through his hair, thinking about how Lorraine's questions, framed with a combination of charm and pressure, had left him little room for casual storytelling, how her insistence on bringing up old controversies and accusations in rapid succession had created a psychological push and pull that most guests might have succumbed to, yet he had chosen the path of direct assertion, calmly stating that he would not be misrepresented on live television, and he reflected on the subtle power dynamics at play, the way hosts wield influence over narrative, the way a carefully worded question can provoke defensiveness, even when no malice is intended, and yet, in this case, he could see clearly that the questions had been designed to escalate, to create friction, to generate headlines, and that realization, while unsettling, also reaffirmed his decision to walk away. Stepping outside into the brisk morning air, Piers felt the weight of the studio building fall behind him like a physical presence, the muted chaos of production staff fading into a distant hum, and he allowed himself a small, private smile at the irony of it all, because he had entered expecting a routine appearance, a chance to share ideas and anecdotes, and instead had orchestrated,